everybody. Thanks for joining us. We're opening up the room about a minute or so early just to give you a chance to get settled, make sure everything's working. Um, if you'd like to say where you're joining us from in the chat, that'd be great. We'd love to hear from you, and we will get started right at noon. If you're having any issues, technical difficulties, go ahead and add that in the chat, and I can try to help you out. Okay, about one more minute here. Thanks for joining us. We've got a great group today. All right, we will go ahead and get started. But again, feel free to let us know where you're joining from in the chat. If you have questions, just let us know. Thanks again for joining us today. My name's Samantha Hooker, and I'll be the moderator for today's Eval Cafe. You may know, but the Eval Cafe is a longstanding speaker series hosted by the Evaluation Center at Western Michigan University in Kalamazoo, Michigan. The series goal is to encourage a deeper dive into all things evaluation. When I'm done talking to you, I will go ahead and add a link to join our mailing list in the chat. This is the last presentation of our spring schedule, so we hope that you'll join us for more presentations this fall, and hopping on our mailing list is going to be the best way to find out what that schedule looks like and have the chance to register for the event. Before we begin, we do like to take a moment to acknowledge the history of the land we're on. Western Michigan University is located on the ancestral lands of the Three Fires Confederacy, which was historically occupied by the Ojibwe, Odawa, and Potawatomi nations, and we honor their stewardship and connection to the land. Today, we're excited to be joined by Sarah Mason. She's the director of the Center for Research Evaluation at the University of Mississippi. She leads a team of 16 evaluators who work on philanthropic, federal, and state-funded evaluations. Before her current position, she worked in evaluation for 15 years, mostly in Australia and across South and Southeast Asia. She's also the co-editor-in-chief of New Directions for Evaluation, and on top of all of that, she's studying yoga therapy and holistic nutrition and dreams of one day living on a tropical island with lots of cats and books. If you have any questions during the presentation, you can enter them in the chat at any time. You can also use the reaction button to raise your hand. And with that, I will hand it over to our presenter.
Thank you so much, Samantha, and hello, everyone. It is lovely to be here. I'm just going to share my screen to get us started. And Samantha, you can let me know if it is not working.
Looks good so far.
Right, great. Well, like I said, I'm absolutely delighted to be here and to talk about one of my favorite topics, how to describe evaluation to people who don't do evaluation. And I think, one, I enjoy talking about it because it's interesting and fun, but the center that I direct is also a soft money funded research center. And so for those of you who might be outside of academia, that essentially means that we operate like a small business. And so my ability to pay my salary, my ability to pay my team's salary, all comes down to being able to convince other people to give us money to do evaluation. And so there is some level of personal interest in exploring this topic as well. And so today what I'll be doing is sharing two research studies that I have worked on in the past, one of them in partnership with Ashley Hunt, that are really focused on, one, how do evaluators describe evaluation? And then two, how does the general public understand evaluation? And then looking at those combined, what does all of that mean about how we might go about talking about evaluation in the hopes that we can enhance understanding about what it is that we do and why it is so valuable. And I think in a lot of ways, we started this study because evaluators often joke about how difficult it is to talk about evaluation. I think we, Ashley and I, when we started the first study, joked about the idea that going to a dinner party was an evaluator's worst nightmare. You're nicely dressed, there's food, there's wine, you sit down, the lovely person next to you turns to you and says, "So what do you do?" And then you think, oh goodness, where are we headed? And it's not just dinner parties. I was in a session with a nutritionist last week. She very politely said to me, "Oh, so Sarah, what do you do?" told her I was an evaluator. And then she awkwardly said, well, that sounds like something that's not relevant to me. And I then had to say, well, that's not actually the case, because as part of your work, you do health education programs. You make me take part in health education programs between our sessions. You do that because you think it helps me. My job is to find out whether that actually does what you think it does. So my job is directly relevant to the work that you do. All of that is to say, it comes up. The idea of what is it that you do and what is evaluation comes up in so many different scenarios. Back when I was doing my PhD, it even came up with my dad. I had tried to explain to him many times what my PhD was in, until eventually one day he said, look, Sarah, your PhD is in something. It is, when you graduate, it will say PhD, parentheses, something. Just tell me the word that is in parentheses. And I had to say, okay, psychology, Dad. But I mean, some kind of anecdotes and jokes aside, this is a topic that matters to the field because, as I said, a large part of our ability to build and establish and to grow a field comes down to how well we communicate about what we do. And this is not a new topic. As far back as the 1970s, Lee Cronbach and colleagues were making the argument that evaluation is not yet rendering the service that it should. And a chief reason for that is that those who commission, conduct, and use evaluation don't have a coherent, comprehensive concept of evaluation. And that remains true today. In the current federal funding environment, this probably becomes even more important. Our ability to be able to describe what we do and why someone might want to fund it is becoming increasingly relevant. Back in 2009, CNN actually listed evaluation as one of the top 10 best kept secrets. So they were looking at kind of the trajectory and growth in the fields as well as the available salaries, but then also noted that no one knew what it was. So there were, there were opportunities to pursue, but no one knew about them. And as I said, this matters because field building occurs within the public domain. So we work in a competitive labor market. Whether or not you're an evaluator who works in the public sector or you're an evaluator who's an independent contractor or consultant, we rely on funds being allocated to the work that we do in order to obtain our salaries, to be able to pay for the work that is required to do an evaluation. And the extent to which funds get allocated is usually a direct reflection of the degree to which funders and decision makers see value in our work. And then this is also consistent with kind of wider research around how professions are developed. And so in some of that literature, much of the findings and much of the arguments would suggest that being able to create a cohesive public narrative is critical to the continued growth and legitimization of a profession. So being able to argue or illustrate that what you do is something unique and is something distinct from other similar offerings. And so that in choosing how to spend funds, one should allocate those funds to, let's say, evaluation as distinct from something else. So kind of that's all of that is to situate the idea and the focus behind the two studies that I wanted to share about today. And I do have to acknowledge right up front that the first study started by complete accident. Ashley and I were doing a qualitative methods class as part of our PhD program, and we had to do a small qualitative study. We had downloaded the list of the AEA Find an Evaluator list from the website and had randomly sampled, also we thought, approximately 30 evaluators, only to find out that we accidentally emailed the entire list. And so when we started getting responses from very well-known evaluators, Michael Scriven being one of them, I think I turned to Ashley and said, I think something else happened beyond what we thought it did. Nevertheless, we were able to then convert our methods project into a larger study that we both enjoyed very, very greatly. And so in the first study that we conducted was a series of interviews with evaluators. asking them to explore how they describe evaluation to non-evaluators, both family and friends, as well as to clients and or prospective clients. We also asked those evaluators to talk to us about challenges and barriers that they might face in trying to describe evaluation, reflections on how people responded to various descriptions, and then to tell us strategies that they found to be effective in communicating evaluation. And so one of the things that emerged from that study was a series of strategies that those evaluators that we spoke with, and if I didn't say it already, we ended up interviewing 42 practicing evaluators from primarily the United States, but we also had some Australian and New Zealand evaluators in that sample as well. But from that, we obtained what we called 6 core strategies that those evaluators found to be effective in communicating about evaluation. The first strategy that they described was what we called contextualizing conversations. And this is not going to come as a surprise to anyone, but the description that you use needs to be dependent on the context in which you are communicating. And so the description that you use with your dentist can't be the same description that you use with your sister, who is a kindergarten teacher, which can't be the same as your neighbor who is the head of a federal agency, for example. All of those would require slightly different adaptations in order to be effective. A second key strategy that they talked about was the idea of listening and asking questions before launching into a very long and descriptive conversation about what you think evaluation is and what they need to know. So a key element of that strategy was first asking questions about who someone is, what they do, how they spend their time, so that you are able to make the adaptations based on context. A third piece was to use relevant examples. And I think underlying this was the idea that, so a very common high-level description was, I evaluate social programs. But in order to understand the phrase, I evaluate social programs, the listener first needs to understand what a social program is. And so what many of the evaluators that we spoke with shared was that there was not yet a solid understanding of what a social program is. And so as a first step, it was important to make sure that they understood what we meant when we said social program or program. And so the purpose of using relevant examples was to identify and share an example or a type of a social program that we might evaluate that is relevant to the person's context. So it could be referencing school lunch programs. It could be referencing literacy, high dosage literacy programs if the person was in the education context. But identifying a specific example or a couple of examples of social programs that might be evaluated as a grounding for any other conversation that you might have. Fourth, again, not going to be kind of new or unique, but using familiar vocabulary. So again, adapting your vocabulary to your audience to ensure that the language that you use is clear and unthreatening. And then a fifth one was the perception or the argument that we needed to emphasize the purpose and value of evaluation in the initial description. So kind of a statement around why we do this. So we do this so that we can understand if programs like school lunch programs actually help young people to be healthier and perform better at school, for example. So one of the common strategies was including a why statement in the description of evaluation to highlight its benefits as part of that conversation. And then finally, keeping it as brief and simple as possible so that you don't overwhelm people. In that same study, when we asked people about the various reactions that people might have, it was affirming in relation to some of our prior personal experiences. Oftentimes there was lack of understanding. Oftentimes there was the phrase eyes glaze over came up very regularly in people's conversations with us. But very promisingly, there was also a large group of the evaluators in that study did also share that when people understood what we were talking about, there was very often oh, that's a job. I'm so glad that people like you exist. So once there was understanding, many of the evaluators felt that there were positive reactions to the work that we do. So that was study one. And what I did in study two was an attempt to try and experimentally and empirically test some of the strategies that evaluators had come up with or shared with us as part of that first study. So I guess one of the foundational questions was to try and empirically explore how well does the general public understand what evaluation is. So we think people don't understand what evaluation is, but how can we go about getting evidence to tell us what people actually think evaluation is when we describe it in different ways? Second purpose and second question was to explore what strategies evaluators might use to enhance the general public's understanding of program evaluation. And then lastly, to look at which strategies evaluators might use to enhance their view about the value of evaluation. And so all of this was based on a number of the strategies that were shared in that first study. And so went about doing this via an online experimental study. To do this, I used an online, I used a Qualtrics sample. So Qualtrics, if you're not familiar with it outside of the platform itself, they also offer a service where they do a panel aggregation service. So they are able to help you obtain demographically representative samples of various populations. And so I was able to use them to help me obtain a demographically representative sample of the US population. And for the purpose of this study, was very broad in defining how I interpreted the general public, that being anyone not involved in conducting evaluation itself. And so had a screener question at the beginning of the survey to ask about people's prior experience with evaluation. I'm seeing that there are some questions coming in. I don't know if any of them are directly relevant to answer now. Oh no, it looks like those are easily addressed later. But to give you an overview of the study, like I said, it was an online experimental study using a Qualtrics sample. So we were able to recruit 530 people originally, but excluded approximately 80 of them. So ended up having a sample of 472 people. They were demographically representative of the US population based on gender, age, race, ethnicity, and level of education. And the way the study was structured was that they were randomly assigned into one of 7 conditions. And the premise of this went back to the beautiful dinner party. So anyone who completed the survey was asked to imagine that they were at a dinner party. They were at a table with 8 people that they didn't know. They turned to the person next to them and they said, they introduced themselves. The person next to them said their name was Casey. And this person asked Casey, "What do you do for a living?" And Casey says, "I'm a program evaluator." And so at that point, this was when they were randomly assigned to one of the 7 conditions. Condition 1 was no explanation of evaluation at all. That was the "I'm a program evaluator" was the only explanation they received. Question 2 was what I called high-level explanation, and I'll go into what these are in a little bit more detail on the next slide. So there's high-level explanation. Condition 3 was the high-level explanation plus a why statement. Condition 4 was high level plus methods. And I should have noted that one of the things that came up in the previous study was that there was a subset of evaluators who did find that it was important to talk about methods, but there was equally a subset of evaluators who thought that talking about methods actually did a disservice and led people to either glaze over or get confused. So that was one of the, some people thought it was good, some people thought it was not good. So it was something that I wanted to experimentally test. So Condition 4 was high-level explanation plus a description of methods. Condition 5 was high-level plus a specific example. 6 was high-level explanation plus an example plus a why statement. And then the 7th condition was everything. So it was a high-level explanation, information on methods, example, and a why statement. So it was everything in the kitchen sink description. And so this is what each of those explanations looked like. The no explanation was just, I'm a program evaluator. The high-level explanation only was, I'm a program evaluator. You ask what that means, and they say, I gather and analyze data about social programs to find out if they do any good or not. The high-level explanation plus the why added in the why statement of, the hope is that we'll be able to provide data and feedback that will help decision makers improve programs' performance and their value to society. The high-level plus methods incorporated the statement, I gather and analyze data about social programs to find out if they do any good or not. Usually that's through things like surveys, interviews, or other data like test scores. And then the high-level plus example was included the statement, you know how government agencies and not-for-profit organizations spend money on things like school lunch programs and substance abuse programs. I gather and analyze data about those programs to find out if they do any good or not. And then the other two were just various combinations of each of those. The goal of which being able, the goal of all of that being to see if we would see differences in level of understanding as well as attitudes towards evaluation based on which of those combinations the person was able to receive. I mean, I do recognize that the descriptions that we used here are kind of grounded in particular approaches to and views of evaluation that are certainly not representative of all, but needed to choose something, and so went with kind of a use-oriented focus in the why statement because of the prevalence of that approach within the field. But yes. Okay. So once they had been given the setup, our participants were asked 3 open-ended questions. Open-ended question 1 was, based on what you know so far, describe evaluation in your own words. Then describe a situation when someone might use evaluation, and then how. So in your own words, describe what you think an evaluator does on a day-to-day basis. Then each of those open-ended comments was coded by a team of 3 coders. So all of those 3 coders were working at a university-based evaluation center at the time. And they coded those comments on a scale from 1, which was not at all accurate, to 4, which was response is accurate given the context. The context being the information that they were given. So obviously, if they were given the example of a school lunch program, if they made reference to a school lunch program, that was relevant. After that, they responded to a series of closed-ended questions. There was a scale intended to measure attitudes towards evaluation, a scale intended to look at value, so perceptions of the value of evaluation. Like I said, we also asked for information on prior experience with evaluation, and then views on how much money should be spent on evaluation. I will say up front, the money question didn't render any particularly interesting results. The rest did, the money part did not. Okay, so with all of that as a setup, our first question was, how well does the public understand what evaluation is? And not very well is the answer. So we think that the general public may not have particularly clear views about evaluation, and that is pretty accurate, particularly when we don't give them any explanation other than I'm a program evaluator. So the I'm a program evaluator was the no explanation condition. And in that condition, 75% of the responses were classified as not at all accurate. And that group across all the 7 groups had the lowest the lowest level of understanding across each of those 7 groups. So just saying I'm a program evaluator is not likely to be effective if you are trying to help people understand what evaluation is. Now, when we looked at just that level of understanding based on the coding of the open-ended responses, and actually pretty consistently across all the ways we looked at this, the most effective way was to include the high-level description plus an example plus a why. So including the example and including the why statement, consistent with what our evaluators thought in the first study, were within this context the most effective of the different strategies that we tried. And so kind of the core message that we extracted from this was that without a more detailed explanation, most people did not understand what evaluation is. One of the most fun things that we did was to look at, for people in the no explanation group, when they were asked to describe evaluation, what did they think that we did? They thought we were computer programmers. The most common misconception was that we were computer programmers, which I guess makes a lot of sense because it uses program, there's computer programming. And so these were some of the examples of what people offered. And I guess contained within here is some semblance of understanding. So there's reference to judging. There is the word of evaluation, but I guess they evaluate program code. I don't know, maybe someone who judges computer programs, reviews computer programs for bugs and usefulness in a particular situation. So I guess the evaluating social programs piece here is not relevant. And so in 29% of the participants in the no explanation group, they offered descriptions that referenced computer programming. And that was significantly higher than in any of the other groups. In all of the other conditions, the percent that referred to computer programming was between 0 and 5. Okay, so then thinking about what strategies can evaluators use to enhance the general public's understanding of program evaluation, we looked at using examples, describing methods, adding a why statement, and then combinations of the above strategies. And so, as I shared earlier, when looking at the use of an example, the example that Casey provided was, you know how government agencies and not-for-profit organizations spend money on social programs like school lunch programs or substance abuse programs. I gather and analyze data about those programs to find out if they do any good or not. And in the various ways that we looked at this, examples do appear to help people build understanding about our work. So across all conditions where people were shown examples rather of evaluation, their levels of understanding were higher than in conditions where people did not receive an example. And so when we look at levels of accuracy, those that were classified in the accurate category, we had 15% versus 4%, mostly accurate 21% to 13%. And then when we jumped down to not at all accurate, we had 64% who were in the no example category, and 42% were in the example category. So all of that is also to say, just an example by itself is not the only tool that we might want to use, because 42% of those who saw the example were still classified as not at all accurate, even though they saw the examples that we shared. So while it may be a tool that we want to incorporate, it's not going to get us to 100% of people who are understanding what we're talking about. So then we looked at methods. That was another strategy. And the language for methods was Casey saying, I gather and analyze data about social programs to find out if they do any good or not. Usually that's through things like surveys, interviews, or other data like test scores. And what we found was that, again, consistent with what our evaluators had thought about in or assumed in our first study, it neither helped nor hindered understanding. So there were no significant differences in levels of understanding across those conditions that were shown the information or the condition that were in the condition with the methods description as compared to those who didn't see the methods information. And then when we were looking at the why, we had Casey adding in, the hope is that we'll be able to provide data and feedback to help improve their performance to society. So very much a focus on improvement and use. What we saw there was, again, that the why statement appeared to help build understanding about evaluation work. And so descriptions with a why statement did result in significantly higher levels of understanding than those who did not use examples. And so very similar to our examples, the proportions were very, very aligned. But again, like with the examples, just using the why statement on its own still left us with about 41% of people who were classified or whose open-ended responses were classified as not at all accurate, even though they saw the why statement. And so that tells us that just like using only an example was not sufficient, also just using a why statement also not sufficient to help build understanding. So then looked at the combination of those who saw examples and a why statement. And like I alluded to earlier, those who saw descriptions with examples and had a why statement had the highest level of understanding. And so there, when we looked at proportions, we got to 32% who had the highest level of accuracy. So they were classified as having kind of level 4 complete accuracy. And we only had 25% who were classified as having the lowest level, so not at all accurate. And so that got us to 75% of people who were within the realm of understanding what evaluation might be. And so key message to take away from all of that would be that including real world examples, along with an explanation of why we do what we can do, can aid in boosting understanding. Certainly there is more to explore and understand because we're still only at 32% within this particular study context. But those two tools combined are a useful strategy that we may embed into what we do. So the last thing that we then explored was the question of value. So we looked at understanding, but then what does all of this suggest about how people perceive and value the work of evaluation based on the description that we share? And so again, we attempted to explore things in different ways, but what we saw, I guess the most interesting thing that we observed was a tentative path model that looked at the relationship between understanding or accuracy rather, and value. And so what it seemed to be was that there was a relationship between using an example and accuracy, and then the level of accuracy of someone's perception and their perception of value. So it was a tentative suggestion to us that first focusing on building that accuracy and building that understanding is a mechanism towards increasing the perceived value of evaluation. So with all of that combined, key messages would be that evaluators think that the general public doesn't understand evaluation particularly well. We would be right. If we are just saying, I'm a program evaluator, the majority of people will not understand what evaluation is, and they will struggle to understand evaluation. Many might think that we are associated with computer programming in some way, shape, or form. However, using examples and emphasizing why we do what we do can help to build understanding. But we also need new and additional strategies because they themselves are not sufficient to get us where we want to be. And so there is certainly value and need to further explore different ways of talking about evaluation to boost understanding and to boost people's perceptions of what it is. And so that is all I had to share today, but I'm very happy to chat and answer any questions if they have come up in the chat box, or just chat further about people's experiences talking about evaluation.
Yeah, and Sarah, there are some questions in the chat, so I have just kind of collected those. If you want, I can just ask them to you. Um, First up, Paul was asking what you think of the old chocolate chip cookie exercise and whether it's a good approximation of evaluation. His thought is it's fun, but it makes him think of metrics and measurements versus evaluation. And then Robert said that he shares it with his Intro to Evaluation course at Syracuse, and the students really like it, and he thinks it's a good discussion point to kind of start like, is that all there is to evaluation? So what do you think?
So I think I have two streams of thought here. One, I have also used it. We have a fellowship program for new and emerging evaluators, and we also use that as one of the exercises that we do at the very beginning. I think it offers a particular perspective on evaluation, or a particular approach to evaluation that may not be evaluation in its fullest sense. So I forgot who it was that referenced kind of perception of metrics and all of that sort of stuff. I certainly think that that is the case. And it can also lead to the perception of evaluation being very, very, why can I not think of the word? The opposite of objective. I don't know why I can't remember the word that is the opposite of objective. Because people get into, well, I like soft cookies, I like hard cookies. Well, we're just going to be different. So we're never, there's not going to be a systematic way for us to do that. But I think if I was just talking to, let's say, my dentist, I'm probably not going to use the chocolate chip cookie example, although it does offer I think as a way of introducing the logic of evaluation, it is a very helpful tool. I will leave that there. Oh, you're on mute, Samantha.
You know, am I even in a virtual meeting if I don't start talking on mute? Like, great, I almost made it. Okay, there were a couple questions about the study. One was whether level of education was one of the demographic questions asked. And the other was were participants screened for their existing knowledge about program evaluation, and were their job or occupations brought into consideration?
Yes, the education level was one of the demographic factors that participants were matched on. So they were broadly representative based on US Census data. And the second component was we did ask about level of exposure to prior experience with evaluation, and took that into account in some of the analyses. There was not a high level, there was a very small proportion of people who had had prior exposure to evaluation, and screened out people who were evaluators.
Okay, thank you. We did have some discussion about what sounds like a pretty adorable children's book called Eva the Evaluator.
Hmm.
Some have read it to their children's preschool class. Bianca's parents were more confused after they read the book than before, but a lot of hearts for Eva, so just pointing that out. Okay, Goldie was wondering if you could discern whether the why statements, are they functioning as a hook that engages a person to more closely listen, or do you think there might be another rationale for its value?
I think that is a great question. Um, I I think in order, I think that understanding why, this might be a circular explanation. I think in order to understand, I think the why helps to understand the what, if that makes sense. So if we're just collecting data about a social program, I think that's just that's just producing something for no purpose whatsoever. And so I think we hope to do it in order to help improve things, is actually a core part of understanding what it is that we do. So if we're taking an improvement-oriented approach to evaluation as opposed to, let's say, just an accountability approach, that understanding that element of the description is actually a core part of the task that we do and the function that we do. So I think it probably serves both of those, but I also saw that Serena had asked a question about, is there follow-up research? That would be something really interesting to explore in follow-up research, because I could be completely wrong. But I think it probably does do both of those, because I think it helps to contextualize the thing that is happening inside a context that people can understand.
Okay, so Goldie followed up and said, so why is really an aspect of what? That's interesting.
That would be my argument. But as I say, I could be entirely wrong.
Okay, and we did have a question from in the room. Could you speak to your experience with using Qualtrics as a source of participants?
It has varied widely. So I've used it in a number of cases, and I think it depends on how broad your desired sample is. And so in this particular instance, it worked very well and was relatively easy to do. It was cost effective. When I attempted to use it for a more constrained population, so specifically a more constrained geographic location, we were looking at Jackson, Mississippi. I'm trying to recall. We may have tried to contain it to Jackson, Mississippi, and then expanded it to Mississippi itself. Then it became much more challenging and more expensive. And we had some issues with Qualtrics as part of that process. So if I were to do it again, I don't know if I would get much more specific than kind of a broad swath of the United States. And we have a survey methodologist on our team at SEER, and she has very specific views about Qualtrics as a sampling mechanism, and it would not be her preferred strategy if we have others available to us.
Okay, thank you. Another question, did your findings show any comments that saw evaluation as research?
That is an interesting question that I don't have an immediate answer to. I don't recall there being anything that was that I don't recall that being a key message that jumped out at me. But I would need to go back and look at some of the open-ended comments to confirm whether that is the case or not, or whether I'm just remembering things poorly. Very possibly it could have been in the methods group, but I'm going off memory that could be inaccurate.
Okay, thank you. That was the last of our questions, so maybe we'll just give it a minute in case anybody thinks of anything. Feel free to put it in the chat or raise your hand. Otherwise, I will move on and wrap this up shortly.
I did see Serena's question about whether I have plans to continue the research any further. I would absolutely love to. And Serena, if that was an offer to help me, I am taking you up on it.
Actually, I think Goldie had a follow-up question in the chat too. She asked, aside from your formative work, did you create the experiment from scratch, or did you draw on an example?
I created it from scratch.
Okay.
So, Sarah, I mean, I would love to hear, did you personally come up with sort of your standard or generic explanation of what you do? Because I'd love to hear it.
Hi, Brad. Yes, I do. I knew someone would ask this, and so I'll probably mess this up. But it generally goes along the lines of you know how governments and organizations spend large amounts of money trying to do good in the world. For example, and here is where I would use an example specific to the person that I'm talking to. People spend large amounts of money on school lunch programs in the hopes that children will be healthier and do better at school. Well, I do research to find out if that actually happens, and and this is where I'm going to go off the rails because I'm being put on the spot. Whether it does what it's expected to do. If not, we then explore how and why they might adjust what they do to enhance the value for the people that they work with.
Thank you. I knew that had to have forced you to come up with something doing this big project. So it's fun. It's something we should probably all try to do.
And it's I definitely don't get 100% hit rate. And I do think a lot of it comes down to, can you articulate an example of a social program that the person understands and can connect with in some way, shape, or form? I think it's oftentimes figuring out who is this person and what types of social programs might they know about and care about, and how can I add that into this statement that I'm trying to offer? Because I think when it hasn't worked, they're kind of looking at me being like, school lunch program? What's a school lunch program? I don't care about school lunch programs. As opposed to, I don't know, the community organization that helps reduce the number of potholes on your street. I don't know. I've never used that one. I don't know if that organization exists, but something that particular person might care about. And I'm seeing Laurie's, you like being mysterious.
Sarah, there was a question in one of the threads as well. What surprised you the most in your findings?
That there was nothing interesting about the money, and that could have been methodological. So I'm curious about whether people just hadn't thought about allocating money to it, whether there was just not enough context to know how to allocate money to it, whether there needs to be a kind of a closer personal connection to the money piece. But I thought there might be some differences in how people would allocate funds to evaluation. Or they just didn't want to allocate money to evaluation. They're like, yeah, that sounds useful. I don't want to pay for it.
Okay. Oh, Lori again. She tells people where she works instead of what she does because then it just postpones the challenge.
And Nicole's kids think he's a doctor of computers and data. I like that.
Okay, well, thank you so much. I think we covered all of our questions. If something pops up, I'll circle back. But Sarah, thank you so much for your presentation today. It was so nice to have you. Super interesting. Sadly, this is our last Eval Cafe for spring, so you're not going to see us again until the fall, but we hope that you'll join us again. I did put our mailing list in the chat one more time if you want to join that. You'll be receiving an email requesting some feedback on the Eval Cafes you might have attended this year. We'd love to hear from you. You might be shocked to know, but we're big fans of evaluation, and we'll definitely use your input to continue to improve the series. I hope that you have a great rest of your day and you will hear from us soon. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.